I want to finish the talk here by bringing it back to where we started in politics here, and winding up the talk. I think Obama's going to win, and I think it's going to be actually more substantial than people think. And I do think it's certainly, I think the Dems are going to hold the Senate, and I do think it's possible, even though people don't think about it, but I think it's possible that the Dems might take back the House. Even if they don't do that, there's going to be a message in this election, I think, about this choice, which is getting teed up, and I think there will be a sense that we're starting to turn the corner a little bit on this discussion. This is my, I'm an optimist, so we'll see. My own politics coming out here a little bit here, but I do think this is actually a pretty decent call, I would say, is going to happen. But what is really the mistake that Americans have made, and I hope you folks don't make it, is that politics for the 20th century politics is looking up at the great leader and thinking that great leader's got to solve all the problems, right? And at the very least, who he appoints in his cabinet has got to solve the problems. That is so 20th century, folks. That is just so not the way the world works, right? It's like Obama, I mean, how can he figure out all this stuff, right? It's just impossible, right? You got to think about it from his point of view. He's looking at him looking out. It's up to us. I mean, he's kind of said that, and he's been kind of mocked a little bit or joked about it, and it's about this election about us. It's totally the right call, folks. It's like the only way we're going to solve this kind of fundamental reinvention, the only way this is going to happen is if it's essentially a much more bottom-up kind of phenomenon that goes through all these different fields. Now, to think about, we think, oh my God, okay, now it's up to us. How are we going to pull this off? I'm going to end this thing just with one last analogy, because I talked about the last analogy was the early 20th century, the progressive era. The most recent transformation of this scale we went through was what happened after the Great Depression and basically World War II. And that's even more instructive. And I think it's actually kind of inspiring in a way, because it actually gives us a sense of like how we could pull this off. The last time this happened of this scale, essentially these folks had their same crazy unprecedented challenges, right? They had, in fact, you really got to say the Great Depression was worse by far than what we had in our Great Recession, their Great Depression. But they had their, terrorist threats. We're talking about terrorist threats. They had Hitler. They had fascism going on. They had basic communism, nuclear war. Nuclear war was their climate change. They had no idea how to stop nuclear war. They were convinced we were going to get nuked to pieces. I mean, I grew up, I'm old enough to grow up. I was growing up like, getting under desks in grade school waiting for the bomb to come, right? It was, you guys don't remember that because we've kind of forgotten that. But that was their climate change freak out, right? But in fact, they basically did what you got to do. There's two things. You can take the technologies you got at hand and your human resources at that period of history, and you got to say, we're going to do the best we can. And so what they did is, this is literally the kind of inner circle of FDR's crew. This is Vannevar Bush here, who was the chief scientist of FDR's chief scientist. He's the guy that is kind of credited with the first guy to really envision the World Wide Web in a classic piece. There's a classic piece you can go back and find on this. But anyhow, the point is, there's a bunch of kind of old white dudes with chalk, trying to figure this plan out, right? And in fact, and again, this is just to remind us, the tools of their time were these, typewriter, they had typewriters. And again, just to remind us how far women have come in this time, the women's role, half of our population didn't get to think about how to solve this. They just got to type out the orders and send it down the road, right? So, it was, that was only 60 years ago, right? But anyhow, they did their best, what they had at the time. And essentially what they did in an extraordinary short amount of time, folks, basically space about 15 years, they came up with a completely new way of economics called Keynesian economics, which at the time was radically different, and in fact now might be not the solution as we debate things, but still was an incredible innovation at the time, and they put it through and they pulled out. They basically solved the kind of security problem, defeated fascism, contained communism, figured out how to basically get that nuclear balance going. There hasn't been one nuclear bomb problem in the last 60 years. That was unthinkable back then. They were certain there was at least going to be certain collateral damage in different scenes. It worked, in other words. They built in the space of 3 years entirely new institutions. Basically, the United Nations, World Bank, IMF happened within 3 years. Whole cloth. Let's just do new ways to coordinate globally or internationally at their time. And they did things like kind of the GI Bill, and they had the FDIC mortgages, and they had Social Security, all these different things that essentially grew this kind of middle class. Anyhow, I'm not saying this is what we would do, but the point is, in the space of literally about 15 years, they came with an explosion of innovation, what I would call reinvention, and essentially they created the world that we're living in still to this day. And now we look back on it and we go, oh my God, they were fucking amazing. Look at, look at FDR. He's in the history books, right? But you know what? Back at that time, when they were starting this thing, they had no idea. So, I would argue, despite kind of, oh my God, we voted for change 4 years ago and it didn't come. Folks, we are in a thing that's going to be, it's not about the 2008 election. It's not about the 2012 election. It's going to be the 2016 election. It's going to be the 2020 election. We're going to be banging at this in 2024. This is a world historical transformation. This is building a kind of new kind of civilization. This is essentially an all digital, all global, sustainable civilization. It's never been done. We don't know how to do it. It's going to take time. That's the way to think about what we're doing here. Luckily, if you took stock of our technologies and our human resources, we've got an incredible array of reinventors, of innovators. I mean, these guys aren't going anyplace. You know, Zuckerberg, he's got 60 years ahead of him, right? The Google guys, they got juice for about 40 more years, right? I mean, you know, this is like, they're not going anyplace. And these are just the tip of the iceberg. Tons of folks of this caliber, right? If you take even just, in the broader sense, anybody with a college education, compared to what happened in the World War II, there was less than 5% of Americans had a college education. It's now about 30%. I mean, in real numbers, it's essentially, we've got 86 million compared to their little piddly 5.6 billion. It's 15 times as many. Now that college-educated people are the only people that kind of value, but I'm just saying, wow, wouldn't you rather have 15 times as many educated people kind of to pull off your reinvention? But the thing that's even more crazy is, could you imagine if you basically would have walked in to FDR and said, hey, I got this thing here that if you basically, you can ask it any question in the world, and you can get all the world's information back, prioritized to you in a second. He would have looked at you like, you got to be nuts. That's just crazy. It's magic. But of course, it's Google, and like everybody has it. Like 5-year-olds know how to work it, right? I mean, it's extraordinary, powerful tools in historical terms. And so, basically, I would say, we have everything we need to make this transition, this reinvention. And I would argue that people in 50 or 100, and I would say even 200 years from now, they'll be looking back and they'll say, it was interesting. It was that early part of the 21st century, and the world was facing up against these really crazy challenges. They were making this very different world, but they figured out a way to redesign all their systems to work in this new digital environment, interconnected, computerized everything, and they redesigned all the systems around that. They figured out a way to kind of completely redesign the planet to work on this kind of global planetary scale in ways that had never been contemplated before, and they figured it out pretty well. And they redesigned all their energy systems, all their kind of consumer items, all their kind of building materials, all their kind of city designs, and they basically figured out a sustainable way to basically work on a planet of about 9 billion people, and they basically turned the corner on climate change. They're going to say, wow. They're going to look back on that time and say, that was an amazing period of history. That wasn't just a kind of interesting part of American history. That was like one of the most fundamentally core periods of reinvention in the history of that country, and ultimately in essentially the history of the world. And if that sounds crazy, just hold that thought, and when you're about to pull that lever in your voting, or when you're talking politics with your buddies, in the next 2 months here, keep in mind this framework and think, you know what? That guy just might be right. And with that, I'm going to say thank you, folks. And and this is that company we're just launching. It's a little splash page right now on the web, so it's not much there. But like I say, in the next couple of months, you're going to see a lot more coming out of this. So.